Oil and gas giant Shell wrapping up its investor day. The company saying that it will return $125 billion to shareholders in the next 5 years if oil prices stay firm. Let's find out how likely that is and what the CEO thinks about the recent Occidental deal for Anadarko. He's with Brian Sullivan for our first on CNBC interview down at the New York Stock Exchange. And Brian, take it away.
All right, Becky, thank you very much. Yeah, if oil prices stay firm, that's a big question mark right now. We're joined by Ben Beurden, CEO of Royal Dutch Shell. Ben, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Ryan.
You're not an oil trader. I get it. But you got Iran sanctions, 2 million barrels exported off the market, Venezuela, rolling disaster. Why is oil in the low 50s?
Well, the oil market is a very difficult market to really penetrate. There's so many moving parts to it, indeed geopolitical parts as well. But what's happening with OPEC, what's happening with Shell, what's happening with long-term projects, what's happening with demand, all these things create quite a confusing picture for the market all the time. If you look at the fundamentals, though, you would probably expect a slightly higher oil price than what we are seeing today.
In your baseline, Becky talked about $125 billion being returned to shareholders in the next few years. Get to that in a moment. Your baseline is 60.
That's right. So if you are in our business with the sort of volatility that you are seeing,
you have to predict a little bit.
You have to predict, but also you have to be conservative. So what we say, let's work with $60 real terms flat all the way up to 25, and let's make our outlook on that basis. It's more likely going to be somewhat higher by that time, but at least we know we are going to be conservative with our outlook. At the same time, we run the company on a very conservative basis as well, debt levels, et cetera, and we basically sanction projects on the lowest possible break-even prices. And these are sensible things to do if you are in the commodity market.
Sounds a little bullish, though. 60 is your conservative projection going forward.
Well, it is. I think we will probably see in that period quite a bit of roller coaster effect still, and it may well be well below 40 or well below 60 or maybe down to 40. But I don't think it's going to stay there. At the same time, I also don't believe that oil will go back to $100 and stay there as well.
Anadarko being bought by Occidental after being approached by Chevron. But what many people may not know is that a lot of that Anadarko property in the Permian is a joint venture with you guys.
Yeah.
What happens to your acreage if and when Occidental completes that deal for Anadarko?
I think probably nothing much will change immediately on the ground. Indeed, we are in what we call an AMI, so it is an area of mutual interest where we work together. And, Oxy most likely then will step into the shoes of Anadarko. We know Oxy well. It's a good operator. And we will have the same arrangements as we would have currently with Anadarko going forward. Probably with a different level of sort of capital planning, different levels of collaboration, but we have to see how it plays out. But fundamentally, nothing changes to the acreage.
Occidental bought Anadarko in part because they're neighbors. They talked about that, Vicky Holub, they're neighbors. You guys aren't just neighbors, you live in the same house. Mm-hmm. Why didn't you try to buy Anadarko?
Well, we look at things all the time, but at the same time, I've also been very clear, post the deal with BG that we did, we had to be very disciplined with our capital, and we said we will not spend more than $25 to $30 billion all the way up to 2020. And of course, this type of deal would not have fit in that capital budget. So you have to be disciplined. We did our deal earlier in the cycle, and now we are still digesting that, and that's okay for me.
You've heard of Carl Icahn, the billionaire investor. He just sued. He thinks Occidental overpaid. Do you think Occidental overpaid for Anadarko?
I don't think that's for me to comment on. I do, by the way, recognize the feeling that we also had post-BG, where a lot of shareholders examine it and just say, was that a wise move? Well, in our case, it turned out to be a wise move, and I'm sure that Occidental will go to the same sort of scrutiny. But let me not comment on what other investors are saying.
You think it'll set off a wave of M&A, or was that a one-off big deal?
I don't know, Brian. Sometimes, indeed, people will expect that one of these will trigger a whole lot more. I don't think really the industry works like that. The industry, certainly after a bit of a binge in the early 2000s, is very, very disciplined to look at what makes sense.
Long hangover.
There's still a bit of a hangover. Yeah.
Let's talk about shareholders because you're finishing up a $25 billion buyback next year. You announced yesterday $125 billion. Becky alluded to it when she came down to us. That is going to be given back through buybacks or dividends, whatever, over the next number of years. That's a lot of money. But yet, you and Exxon and others are down. Your stock is down over the past year. You have all this good news, increased free cash flow, and all that money you're giving back. and the market has not rewarded you. What are investors missing?
Well, I think the sector is, at this point in time, still a little bit in the doghouse. It will take some time before people sort of get their interest back into the sector and see it indeed as a great opportunity for growth in the future. I think the story that we have, where we indeed are going to give back $125 billion, that's half the market capitalization of Shell at the moment in the period 21 to 25. At some point in time, Brian, fundamentals are going to reassert themselves. And people are going to see that, hey, if I get that type of yield on my investment, I better be part of the growth story that will bring.
But, you know, investors, to your point, using the earlier analogy, have been hung over. They got burned in oil and gas. And the industry has had pretty much a negative to flat net return for shareholders over the last decade.
Yeah.
Why do you see that changing?
Well, I think because the industry has been changing as a result of that. I do believe that indeed since the middle of this decade, discipline has really set in. And of course, we had to. But I think also you will have seen that the large players have really been very effective in sticking with that discipline. So at some point in time, the hangover will be over. I think we're nearing the end of it. And indeed, the prospects ahead of us are going to be more important than perhaps the hangover of the past.
Well, we're going to find out. There's no pill for that hangover, by the way.
No.
Ben van Beurden, CEO of Royal Dutch Shell, here at the New York Stock Exchange. A real pleasure. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, bro.